The blood oath shattered at midnight when Luna Astrid of House Thornval threw the royal decree into the ceremonial flames and told her paralyzed mate he would die alone. King Björn the Unconquered, Alpha of the Northern Realms, heir to the throne of 5 conquered territories, bound by pack law to a woman who now despised him, lay motionless in his bed as his wife's footsteps echoed through marble halls for the final time. The curse that had stolen his ability to walk had also stolen her loyalty. 300 witnesses had watched her renounce their bond in the Great Hall. Her voice steady as she declared him unfit to rule, unfit to breed, unfit to live. The council had voted. The succession required an heir. And Astrid had already chosen his replacement. But here's what no one knew. A kitchen maid named Freja, born of a forbidden bloodline, had been watching from the shadows. And she would crawl through fire to reach him. Before we continue, tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. You're about to witness a betrayal so devastating. It will rewrite everything you thought you knew about loyalty, love, and the brutal cost of power. Freja had scrubbed the king's floors for 7 years, invisible as the stone beneath her knees. She'd been born in the servant quarters to a mother whose bloodline was forbidden from speaking, descendants of the vanquished clans, those who'd lost the Great War and been relegated to silence by pack law. Freja had no wolf, no voice in the council, no right to even look directly at an alpha, much less the king. But she'd looked anyway. Every morning when she brought fresh linens to the royal chambers, she'd stolen glances at King Björn, the warrior whose shoulders had carried the weight of a kingdom, whose eyes held storms even before the curse struck him down. The curse had come 3 months ago, delivered by a witch whose sister Björn had executed for treason. One moment he'd been standing at the throne, delivering judgment. The next, his legs had crumpled beneath him, nerveless, dead. The royal physicians had tried everything. Spells, potions, ancient remedies from the forbidden archives. Nothing worked. And with each passing day, Luna Astrid's affection had curdled into something cold and calculating. Freja had witnessed it all from the margins. She'd seen Astrid's visits to the king's chambers grow shorter, her smiles tighter. She'd overheard whispered conversations between the Luna and the council members. Lord Dagmar, Lady Solveig, Commander Stellan. They spoke of succession laws, of the pack's need for strong leadership, of the impossibility of a paralyzed king producing the heir required by royal decree. Astrid's eyes had begun to wander toward Commander Stellan, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty. The night of the renunciation, Freja had been polishing silver in the alcove adjacent to the Great Hall when Astrid had made her announcement. The Luna had stood before the assembled court in a gown of deep crimson. Her blonde hair braided with gold thread, her posture regal. Björn had been brought in on a litter, his face impassive, his hands resting uselessly in his lap. The sight had broken something in Freja's chest. This man who had once shifted into a wolf so massive it blotted out the sun, reduced to being carried like cargo. Astrid's voice had rung clear through the hall. By pack law and royal decree, I invoke my right to dissolve a bond rendered incomplete by incapacitation. King Björn can no longer fulfill his duties as Alpha, as protector, or as sire to the heir our kingdom requires. The blood oath we swore before the moon goddess is hereby severed. I claim my freedom, and I name Commander Stellan as my chosen mate and rightful heir to the throne. The silence that followed had been suffocating. Then Lord Dagmar had risen. His ancient voice weighted with false sympathy. The council recognizes Luna Astrid's claim. Pack law is clear. An alpha unable to defend his territory or produce offspring forfeits his right to rule. King Björn will be granted chambers in the East Wing, where he may live out his days in comfort. The coronation of Commander Stellan and the bonding ceremony with Luna Astrid will take place within the fortnight. Björn hadn't spoken, hadn't protested. He'd simply closed his eyes as though accepting an inevitable execution. And something in Freja had ignited. Not love, not yet, but recognition. She knew what it felt like to be discarded, to be deemed worthless by those in power. She knew the particular agony of invisibility. So when the guards wheeled Björn's litter back toward the East Wing, Freja had followed at a distance. And when they deposited him in the sparse chambers that would become his prison, a far cry from the opulent rooms he'd occupied as king, she'd waited until the palace fell silent. Then she'd slipped through the servants' passage and entered his room without permission, without announcement, without any right whatsoever. Björn had been staring at the ceiling when she entered, his jaw tight, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like chips of ice. He didn't turn his head when the door closed. "If you're here to ensure I'm comfortable in my cage, you can report back that the bars are adequate." Freja had frozen, startled by the bitterness in his voice. She'd expected rage, maybe, or despair. But this cold, resigned fury was somehow worse. She'd set down the tray she'd brought, bread, cheese, wine, and moved closer, her hands trembling. "I'm not here on anyone's orders, Your Majesty. I'm not a majesty anymore." His voice was flat. "I'm a cripple who's been discarded by his mate and his court. You can call me whatever you like. Or call me nothing at all." She'd knelt beside his bed then, a breach of protocol so severe it could have earned her a whipping. But she'd done it anyway, meeting his eyes for the first time in 7 years. "I'm Freja. I've cleaned these halls since I was 10 years old. And I'm here because what happened tonight was wrong." Something had flickered in his gaze. Surprise, maybe. Or suspicion. "You think the council cares about right and wrong? Pack law is absolute. I can't walk. I can't shift. I can't produce an heir. Therefore I'm no longer useful. Pack law is written by those in power to maintain their power," Freja had said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "My entire bloodline was silenced because we lost a war 3 generations ago. We're forbidden from speaking in council, from challenging alphas, from even testifying in disputes. Does that sound like justice to you? Or does it sound like convenient oppression?" Björn had studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, "You're from the vanquished clans. You shouldn't even be here. If anyone discovers you've spoken to me, let them." She'd surprised herself with the steel in her voice. "I've spent 7 years invisible. I'm tired of pretending I don't exist." That conversation had been the beginning. Freja had returned the next night, and the night after that. She'd brought food, books, news from the court. She'd helped him sit up, adjusted his pillows, massaged the useless muscles of his legs, even though the physicians had said it was pointless. And slowly, incrementally, she'd begun to see past the broken king to the man underneath. Björn was sharp-minded, well-read, surprisingly kind despite his circumstances. He told her stories of the wars he'd fought, the territories he'd united, the reforms he'd implemented to protect the weakest members of the pack. He'd been a good king, she realized. And Astrid had abandoned him not because he'd failed, but because he'd become inconvenient. But their fragile routine was shattered 3 weeks after the renunciation. Freja had arrived at Björn's chambers to find Commander Stellan waiting in the corridor. His arms crossed, his expression predatory. He was a tall man with sharp features and eyes like flint, his hair dark where Björn's was golden. He wore the royal insignia now. Luna Astrid had wasted no time marking him as her chosen. "The little maid who thinks she can play healer," Stellan had said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Did you think we wouldn't notice your visits? The guards report everything, girl. Every breach of protocol. Every inappropriate interaction." Freja's blood had turned to ice. "I'm doing nothing wrong. I'm caring for a man who's been abandoned by those who swore to protect him." Stellan had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You're caring for him. A servant from a forbidden bloodline, who has no rank, no status, no right to even speak his name. You think that looks like compassion? To the court it looks like ambition. It looks like a desperate attempt to seduce a fallen king and claim some scrap of power for yourself. That's not. It doesn't matter what it is. It matters what it looks like." He'd stepped closer, looming over her. "Luna Astrid is concerned. She worries that your attentions might give the former king false hope. Hope that someone might challenge the succession. Hope that he might somehow reclaim what he's lost. We can't have that. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to stop these visits. You're going to return to your duties in the kitchens. And you're going to forget that Björn exists. If you don't, I'll have you arrested for attempting to manipulate a member of the royal family. The punishment for that is banishment. Or worse. Freja had wanted to argue to fight, but she'd seen the cold certainty in his eyes. Stellan wasn't bluffing. He would destroy her without hesitation. So she'd nodded, lowered her gaze, and walked away. But she hadn't forgotten. She'd simply become more careful. For the next 2 weeks, she'd avoided Björn's chambers during patrol hours. She'd slipped in through the servants' passages in the dead hours before dawn, staying only long enough to bring supplies and whisper reassurances. Björn had protested at first, insisted she was risking too much. But she'd been stubborn, relentless. "They've already taken everything from you," she'd told him. "I won't let them take your dignity too. Even if I'm the only one who sees it." Those stolen hours had deepened into something neither of them could name. Freja found herself thinking about Björn during her long shifts in the kitchens, the way his eyes softened when she read to him, the dry humor that surfaced when he forgot to be bitter, the rare smiles that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. And Björn, isolated and abandoned, had begun to look forward to her arrivals with an intensity that frightened him. She was forbidden, unsuitable, impossibly beneath his station. But she was also the only person in the kingdom who saw him as something more than a broken thing to be hidden away. The crisis came 5 weeks after Astrid's renunciation. Freja had been chopping vegetables in the kitchen when she'd overheard 2 guards talking near the hearth. "Council meeting tonight," one had said. "They're finalizing the execution order." Freja's knife had clattered to the floor. Execution order. The guards had exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. One shrugged. "The former king. Luna Astrid convinced the council he's a liability. As long as he lives, there's always a chance someone might rally behind him, challenge the new succession. Better to eliminate the problem cleanly. They're calling it a mercy, putting him out of his misery. They can't. Pack law doesn't allow. Pack law allows whatever the council decides," the other guard had interrupted. "And they've decided Björn is more useful dead than alive. The order will be carried out tomorrow at dawn." Freja had run. She'd dropped her apron, abandoned her post, and sprinted through the servants' corridors toward the east wing. She'd burst into Björn's chambers without knocking, her breath ragged, her eyes wild. "They're going to kill you. Tomorrow. Astrid convinced the council you're a threat." Björn had been sitting by the window, his useless legs covered with a blanket. He'd turned slowly, his expression eerily calm. "I know. You know. How can you just... You have to run, we have to get you out of here." "Freja." His voice had been gentle, resigned. "I can't run. I can barely sit upright without help. Where would I go? How would I survive? Maybe this is better. Clean end. No more humiliation. No more being a burden." "Don't say that." She'd crossed the room, gripping his shoulders, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're not a burden. You're a king who was cursed, betrayed, and abandoned. That doesn't make you worthless. It makes you a survivor. A survivor who's about to be executed. Not if I have anything to say about it." The words had come out fierce, reckless. She'd had no plan, no resources, no allies. But she'd known, with absolute certainty, that she couldn't let him die. Not like this. Not when he'd already lost everything else. Björn had stared at her, something shifting in his expression. Vulnerability, hope, fear. "Why? Why would you risk yourself for me? You owe me nothing. If anything, my family's laws are what condemned your bloodline to servitude. I'm part of the system that oppressed you. You're also the man who read legal reforms late into the night, trying to find loopholes that would grant my people more rights. I saw the documents on your desk, the notes in your handwriting. You were trying to change things, even when no one was watching. She'd swallowed hard. And you're the only person in this entire palace who's ever looked at me like I'm a person, not a ghost. So yes, I'll risk myself. Because you're worth saving. The silence between them had been electric, charged with everything unsaid. Then Björn had lifted one hand, shakily with effort, and touched her cheek. If we do this, there's no going back. They'll hunt us. Astrid won't allow any challenge to her claim. And you'll be branded a traitor, a kidnapper. Your life will be forfeit. Then let it be forfeit. She'd covered his hand with hers. I've been dead inside these walls for 7 years anyway. I'd rather be alive and hunted than safe and invisible. They'd spent the rest of the day planning. Freja had stolen supplies from the kitchens. Food, blankets, a dagger she'd taken from an unguarded weapons rack. She'd bribed a stable boy with her only possession of value, a silver pendant her mother had given her, in exchange for his silence and a horse-drawn cart. And when night fell, she'd returned to Björn's chambers one final time. Getting him out had been brutal. He'd weighed more than she'd anticipated, dead weight that she'd had to drag inch by agonizing inch across the floor. Her back had screamed. Her arms had shaken. But she'd refused to stop, refused to fail. By the time she'd maneuvered him into the cart and covered him with burlap sacks, her hands had been bleeding, her dress soaked with sweat. The stable boy had stared at her like she'd lost her mind. Maybe she had. They'd made it through the palace gates by sheer luck. The guards had been changing shifts, distracted by the chaos of preparations for Astrid's upcoming coronation. The city beyond had been dark, the streets empty. Freja had driven the cart with hands that wouldn't stop trembling, every shadow a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of pursuit. Björn had stayed silent beneath the sacks, his breathing shallow, his body rigid with tension. They'd traveled until dawn, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the palace. When the sun finally rose, Freja had pulled the cart into a dense thicket of trees and collapsed beside it, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Björn had pushed the burlap aside, his face pale, his eyes shadowed. You actually did it. You got me out. We got us out, she'd corrected. This is just the beginning. They'll come looking. Astrid won't rest until you're dead and I'm in chains. Then we don't rest either. Despite everything, despite his useless legs and stolen kingdom, Björn had managed a grim smile. You've shown me something I thought I'd lost, Freja. You've shown me that I still have something worth fighting for. So let's fight. But the fight was far more complicated than either of them had imagined. Because that night, as they huddled in the forest, Björn had begun to shake. Violently. Uncontrollably. His skin had burned with fever. His eyes rolling back in his head. Freja had tried everything. Cold compresses, water, desperate prayers to the moon goddess. Nothing worked. And as she'd held him, terror clawing at her throat, she'd realized the horrible truth. The curse hadn't just paralyzed him. It was killing him. Slowly. Inch by inch. And she'd just dragged him away from the only place where he might have received treatment. The fever had broken near dawn, leaving Björn weak and drenched in sweat. He'd looked at her with eyes that held too much understanding. You felt it, didn't you? The curse is progressing. The witch didn't just take my legs. She's taking my life. Piece by piece. Freja had wanted to deny it, to insist he'd be fine. But she couldn't lie. Not to him. Then we find the witch. We make her reverse it. She's dead. I executed her. Then we find someone else. A healer, a mage, anyone who might know how to break this. She'd gripped his hand, refusing to let despair win. I didn't drag you out of that palace just to watch you die in the woods. We'll find a way. But finding a way required resources they didn't have. They'd been in the forest for 3 days, rationing their meager supplies, when they'd heard the sounds of pursuit. Horses, dogs, the shouts of guards. Astrid had sent hunters. And they were closing in fast. Freja had made a split-second decision. She'd hidden Björn in a hollowed-out tree trunk, covering the entrance with branches and moss. Then she'd taken the cart and driven it in the opposite direction, creating a false trail. The hunters had followed, their bloodlust palpable. She'd led them on a chase through ravines and streams, anything to buy Björn time. But eventually, they'd cornered her at a cliff's edge. Commander Stellan had been among them, his face twisted with fury. "Where is he?" Stellan had demanded, dismounting and advancing on her. "Where's the crippled king you stole? Safe from you." She'd lifted her chin, defiant even with nowhere left to run. "You'll never find him." Stellan had struck her then, a vicious backhand that had sent her sprawling. "You stupid, stupid girl. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've committed treason. Kidnapping a member of the royal family. Interfering with a lawful execution. Luna Astrid wants your head on a pike. Luna Astrid is a traitor who abandoned her mate for power. She has no honor and no right to judge me." Another blow, harder this time. Freja had tasted blood. But she'd smiled through it, knowing that every second she kept Stellan talking was a second Björn had to hide. "If you kill me, you'll never find him. He'll vanish into these woods, and you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if he's out there, planning his revenge." Stellan had grabbed her by the throat, lifting her until her feet left the ground. "Then I'll make you talk. I'll make you scream until you beg to tell me where he is." But before he could make good on the threat, a horn had sounded in the distance. One of the scouts, calling for assistance. Something was happening back at the palace. Something urgent. Stellan had cursed, dropping Freja in a heap. "Bind her. We're taking her back. Astrid can decide how she wants to handle this." They dragged Freja onto a horse, her wrists tied with rope that bit into her skin. The journey back to the palace had taken hours. By the time they'd arrived, night had fallen again. Freja had been thrown into the dungeons, a cold cell that smelled of mold and despair. She'd had no idea if Björn had survived, if he'd managed to stay hidden, if the fever had claimed him. All she could do was wait and hope she'd bought him enough time. But 2 days later, the cell door had opened, and Luna Astrid herself had entered. The former Luna, soon to be queen, looked radiant in a gown of midnight blue, her hair crowned with silver. She'd studied Freja with cold amusement. The maid who thought she could play savior. How quaint. Freja had forced herself to stand, even though her legs were weak from hunger and fear. "I saved the man you abandoned. That's not playing. That's doing what you were too cowardly to do." Astrid's smile had sharpened. "Is that what you think happened? That I abandoned him out of cowardice? Let me educate you, little maid. I spent 10 years bonded to Björn. 10 years watching him wage wars, make impossible decisions, sacrifice everything for the good of the pack. I admired him. I even loved him in my way. But when the curse struck, I saw the truth. He'd become a liability. Not because of his legs, but because he'd given up. He accepted defeat. He let himself become weak. And I refused to be shackled to weakness. He didn't give up. He was betrayed by the one person who swore to stand by him. I stood by him long enough." Astrid's voice was ice. "And now you've complicated everything. The council is demanding your execution. They want to make an example of you. Show what happens when a servant oversteps her bounds. But I have a better idea." She'd leaned in close, her breath warm on Freja's ear. "I'm going to offer you a choice. Tell me where Björn is hiding, and I'll grant you clemency. You'll serve out your days in the kitchens, alive but invisible. Refuse, and I'll have you executed at dawn, slowly, in front of the entire court. What will it be, little maid? Your life or his?" Freja had met Astrid's gaze without flinching. "I'd rather die than betray him. So do your worst." Astrid had laughed, a sound like breaking crystal. "I was hoping you'd say that. Stellan owes me a show, and your execution will be quite the spectacle. Sleep well, traitor. Tomorrow, you'll learn what happens to those who defy pack law." But Freja hadn't died at dawn. Because that night, as she'd sat in her cell awaiting execution, The dungeon walls had exploded inward. Stone and dust had filled the air, and through the chaos, a figure had emerged. Massive, golden-furred, eyes blazing with fury. Wolf. Björn's wolf. Somehow, impossibly, he'd shifted. The curse had broken. And he'd come back for her. The wolf had torn through the guards like they were made of paper. It had ripped the cell door off its hinges, gently taken Freja by the collar of her dress in its massive jaws, and carried her out through the hole it had created. Behind them, alarms had blared. Voices had shouted. But the wolf had been faster, disappearing into the night with Freja clinging to its fur. Her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. They'd run for hours, the wolf's powerful legs eating up the distance between the palace and the forest. When they'd finally stopped in a clearing, the wolf had set Freja down gently, then begun to shift. The transformation had been agonizing to watch, bones cracking, fur receding, limbs reshaping. But when it was over, Björn had stood on his own 2 feet for the first time in months. He'd been naked, scarred, trembling with exhaustion. But he'd been whole. Freja had stared at him, tears streaming down her face. How? The curse broke when you were captured. His voice had been raw, barely recognizable. I don't know how. Maybe it was rage. Maybe desperation. Or maybe. He'd looked at her with an intensity that stole her breath. Maybe it was you. Maybe saving you was the thing that finally made me strong enough to fight it. She'd thrown her arms around him then, not caring about propriety or protocol or the fact that he was naked and covered in blood and filth. She'd held him like he was the only real thing in the world. And he'd held her back, his arms fierce and desperate around her. We can't go back, Björn had said against her hair. Astrid will never stop hunting us. The council will declare us outlaws. We'll spend the rest of our lives running. Then we run. Freja had pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. I don't care where we go or how hard it gets. As long as we're together, I can face anything. Björn had cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. I don't deserve you. A king who lost everything, who let himself be broken. You're not broken. You're scarred. There's a difference. She'd pressed her forehead to his. And I don't want a perfect king. I just want you. He'd kissed her then, fierce and desperate and full of everything words couldn't capture. And in that moment, with the palace burning in the distance and hunters on their trail, Freja had known she'd made the right choice. She'd chosen love over safety, loyalty over law, a broken king over an entire kingdom. But their respite was short-lived. 3 days later, as they'd been traveling through the mountains, they'd been ambushed. Not by palace guards, but by something worse. Mercenaries hired by Astrid, killers with no loyalty except to gold. They'd surrounded Björn and Freja in a narrow pass, weapons drawn, faces hidden behind masks. The leader had spoken in a voice like gravel. Former King Björn and the maid Freja. Luna Astrid sends her regards. She's offered 1,000 gold pieces for your heads. We're here to collect. Björn had pushed Freja behind him, his body tense, ready to shift. But before he could, one of the mercenaries had fired a crossbow. The bolt had struck Björn in the shoulder, and he'd gone down with a cry of pain. Freja had screamed, lunging toward him, but hands had grabbed her, hauled her back. She'd fought like a wildcat, biting and clawing, but there'd been too many of them. The leader had approached Björn, drawing a wicked-looking blade. Nothing personal, Your Majesty. Just business. But as he'd raised the blade, a new voice had cut through the chaos. Stop! Everyone had frozen. A figure had emerged from the trees. Tall, cloaked, face hidden in shadow. But the power radiating from them had been unmistakable. Magic. Old magic, the kind that made the air itself shiver. This man is under my protection, the figure had said. Leave now and you live. Stay and you don't. Choose quickly. The mercenaries had exchanged nervous glances. Then, one by one, they'd backed away, vanishing into the forest like smoke. The leader had lingered a moment longer, then cursed and followed his men. The cloaked figure had approached Freja and Björn, kneeling beside them. When they'd pulled back their hood, Freja had gasped. It was a woman, ancient and beautiful, with eyes that held the weight of centuries. "You're the witch," Björn had rasped. "The one I executed." "Her sister," the woman had corrected. "Ingrid. The witch you killed was my younger sibling, Luna. I cursed you out of grief and rage. But watching you these past months, watching your fall and your fight, I've come to regret that choice." "Why?" Björn's voice had been bitter. "I took your sister from you. I deserve every punishment you could devise." Ingrid had shaken her head. "Luna committed treason. She tried to poison the water supply of an entire city to prove a point about royal corruption. You did what any king would do. You protected your people. I was too blinded by grief to see that. But I see it now. And I see something else. You've learned what it means to lose everything. You've learned humility, compassion, sacrifice. The curse served its purpose. It's time to let it go fully." She'd placed her hands on Björn's shoulder, where the bolt still protruded. He'd screamed as magic flooded through him, white-hot, searing. But when it faded, the wound had closed, the poison neutralized. He'd struggled to his feet, whole and strong, staring at Ingrid with disbelief. "Why are you helping us?" "Because the real threat isn't you. It's Astrid. She's made a pact with dark forces to secure her power. Blood magic, forbidden rituals. If she's crowned queen, she'll plunge the kingdom into shadow. You're the only one who can stop her." Ingrid had held out a small vial filled with glowing liquid. "This is starlight essence, distilled from the tears of the moon goddess herself. When the time comes, you'll know how to use it. But be warned. It can only be used once. And it will cost you." "Cost me what?" "That depends on what you're willing to sacrifice." And with that cryptic warning, Ingrid had vanished, leaving Björn and Freja alone in the mountain pass, clutching the vial and each other. They'd traveled for 3 more weeks, gathering allies, outcasts, vanquished clan members, soldiers who'd grown disillusioned with Astrid's rule. Slowly, quietly, they'd built a rebellion. And when Astrid's coronation day arrived, Björn had stood at the head of a small but determined army, ready to reclaim what had been stolen. The battle had been brutal. Astrid's forces outnumbered theirs 3-1. But Björn had fought like a man possessed, his wolf form tearing through enemy lines, his voice rallying his people. Freja had fought beside him, wielding a sword she'd barely known how to use, refusing to leave his side. They'd breached the palace gates as the sun set, storming the great hall where Astrid was being crowned. She'd been standing at the throne, crown in hand, when Björn had burst through the doors. For a moment, everything had frozen. Astrid's eyes wide with shock, the council members gaping, Commander Stellan reaching for his sword. "This coronation is illegal," Björn had roared, his voice echoing through the hall. "Astrid broke her blood oath. She consorted with dark magic. And she tried to have me assassinated. By pack law, she's forfeited her right to rule." Astrid had recovered quickly, her expression hardening. "You're a fugitive, Björn. A cursed king who abandoned his throne. You have no authority here. I have the authority of every person you've betrayed." Björn had gestured to the army behind him. "And I have proof of your crimes." He'd thrown a leather satchel onto the floor. Documents had spilled out, records of Astrid's dealings with blood witches, contracts signed in her own hand, testimonies from witnesses she'd thought she'd silenced. The council had stared in horror. Lord Dagmar had risen, his face pale. "If these documents are authentic." "They are," Ingrid had said, materializing beside Björn. Her presence had sent shockwaves through the hall. "I witnessed Luna Astrid's pact myself. She traded innocent lives for power. By ancient law, that makes her unfit to rule." Astrid's mask had finally cracked. She'd let out a scream of rage and lunged at Björn, her hands crackling with dark energy. They'd clashed in the center of the hall, power against power, magic against magic. The fight had been vicious, destructive, shaking the very foundations of the palace. And in the midst of it, Freja had seen Commander Stellan moving toward Bjorn's exposed back, dagger drawn. Without thinking, she'd thrown herself between them. The blade had pierced her side, agony exploding through her body. She'd collapsed, blood pooling beneath her, her vision fading. The last thing she'd heard was Bjorn's roar of anguish, the sound of Astrid's scream as starlight erupted through the hall. Then darkness had claimed her. She'd woken days later in a soft bed, sunlight streaming through windows. Bjorn had been sitting beside her, his hand wrapped around hers, his eyes red-rimmed. When he'd seen her wake, he'd let out a sob of relief. "You're alive. Thank the goddess you're alive." "What happened?" Her voice had been a rasp. "I used the starlight essence. It destroyed the dark magic Astrid had unleashed. But the cost..." His voice had broken. "It severed my connection to the wolf. I can't shift anymore, Freja. The curse is truly gone, but so is half of what I am." She'd squeezed his hand, tears sliding down her face. "Then we're even. I'm not a wolf either. We'll figure out how to be human together." He'd kissed her then, gentle and reverent. "Astrid's in exile. The council voted to reinstate me as king. But I'm rewriting pack law, all of it. Your bloodline, the vanquished clans, everyone who's been silenced. You'll have full rights, full voices. I'm building the kingdom I should have built from the start. And I want you beside me. Not as a maid. As my queen." Freja had stared at him, overwhelmed. "I'm not royalty. You're the woman who crawled through hell to save me when everyone else walked away. If that doesn't make you a queen, nothing does." 6 months later, Queen Freja of House Thornval stood on the palace balcony, watching the sun rise over the kingdom that had once rejected her. Beside her, King Björn wrapped an arm around her waist, pressing a kiss to her temple. Below, in the courtyard, children from all bloodlines played together, vanquished and victor, servant and noble. The old divisions were slowly healing. It hadn't been easy. The council had resisted. Some nobles had fled rather than accept a servant queen. But Bjorn had been relentless, and Freja had proven herself capable, intelligent, and fiercely protective of her people. Together, they'd begun to build something new. "Any regrets?" Bjorn asked, his voice soft. Freja smiled, leaning into his warmth. "Only that I didn't crawl back for you sooner." And as the kingdom woke around them, 2 people who'd once been broken stood whole, their love a testament to the power of loyalty, sacrifice, and refusing to let the world tell you who you're allowed to save. Then. But wait, there's one secret we didn't reveal. The real reason Ingrid broke the curse. The real reason the starlight essence worked. Freja wasn't from a forbidden bloodline by accident. Her mother had been the daughter of the moon goddess herself, hidden among mortals to escape an ancient prophecy. And when Freja had chosen love over safety, she'd fulfilled that prophecy. Only a child of the goddess, willing to sacrifice everything for a fallen king, could break the cycle of power and vengeance that had plagued the realm for generations. Freja didn't know yet, but she would. And when she did, her true power would awaken, a power that would either